Thank God. Okay. So we're going to carry on today in our book, Strive for Truth. We're going to hopefully we're going to make a little bit more progress. And we're going to pick up from where we left off last week. I first just want to open up if anybody had any questions, anything that occurred to them over the course of this week, if they had any moments I wanted to share, anything before I jump right in. Okay, let us begin. So we are up to, we started discussing last week the idea of the Yetzer Hara and the Yetzer Tov, the inclinations, being able to channel our inclination in the right way is where we kind of left off. And he, interestingly enough, I'm not going to read this whole chapter inside, but the gist of this specific chapter, that's chapter 10, is he talks about this idea of how do we void this ambition coming from the wrong place? How do we want to, not void, how do we avoid rather? How do we avoid this ambition? We're in the concept of ambition, recognizing that everything in life comes from you're either a giver or a taker. And we have now established that even ambition can be coming from the wrong place. And he's saying, how do we, if ambition is such a big part of life, and it's something that is the constant drive to humanity, how do we avoid falling into this trap? And this chapter, definitely, I refer back to what we started last week, where we spoke about the idea that it's lofty, it's a very high level. But in essence, what he describes over here is that what one really needs to do, and this is actually fascinating to me. I'll first say the points, and then I'll see what you say as if you can understand why I think it's so fascinating. Because he says that we learn how to treat ambition from the ways that some of our great sages have taught us. And what he says is that the only way to properly channel and utilize ambition in the right way is by starving the ambition, not by satiating it, which means that what he goes on to explain is that you can only cure the ambition by, meaning you can only heal the hunger, right? We call the ambition the hunger. He says you can only heal the hunger with hunger. So essentially what he's saying is that when you starve the ambition, when we're able to literally just put ourselves, again, high level, but when we can actually get to the place of being able to completely starve it, eventually, says Rabbi Dessler, eventually that is the only prescription that will actually rid the hunger itself. Now, why do I say, for those of you who know Musar, or really just really a lot within Torah, why do I say that this is such an interesting approach? Any thoughts about that? Go ahead. Was somebody just going to say something? No. Normally, we learn about the concept of a balance. You come somewhere in between. You go from one extreme to the next, and you're going to hopefully fall out somewhere in between. And what's so fascinating about this, and perhaps it's connected, but the idea is that there is no balance, because Rabbi Dessler started off by saying that it either comes from the root of being a giver or being a taker. There is no such thing as a balance. And he goes on in his book to give such wildly extreme examples. And we discussed it a little bit when we were talking in the class about, who do we know who doesn't really want physical things? Like, do we know people like that? But the examples of different sages who, for example, one story that I had heard was a sage who didn't want to be a taker, but he needed a refrigerator. So somebody delivered a refrigerator. He left it in the box. He's like, I'm not, you know. The level of this is a very, very, very high level, you know, understanding what that means. But that's why I don't even want to go through in reading the next chapter we're going to read through and really break it down. But I think it's just a very important thing to recognize that the only way to really work on this is by learning how to starve that hunger, by learning how to say no more, by learning how to understand that if it's coming from the root of taking, it's coming from a bad place. And we have to be careful of that. And he refers to this idea of being ambitious in the hungry way. He refers to it as a disease. And he says that, you know, the only way, I'll read you this one line, he says, is that his life, that is true, the only way to really rid this, and that it is surely better to undergo a little bit of hunger than to ruin one's own life completely. Because he so strongly feels that being a taker can be the root of all evil. And if we don't get it under control, it can spiral out of control and ruin one's life. And so starving it is the only way. Okay, so keep that in mind as we now ease into the next chapter. Okay, it was a very, very short chapter, but a strong and a very intense reminder. And I just want to reiterate what we started off last week by saying. These are very lofty heights that we're talking about right now, but understanding it and understanding that it exists and understanding that the concept exists is still something that we want to understand and strive towards, even though it might sound so lofty. Okay. And I will also add in that he mentions over here that there is something that says that a wise person hates gifts. Like what is that? Like why is that? Someone who hates gifts, a wise person should hates gifts, and a person who hates gifts shall live. This is a certain quote from the Midrash. So what is that, right? Because when we can learn to be more of a giver rather than a taker, that will enhance our quality of life. Okay. So very interesting now what he's going to get to. And we're going to now move into the chapter 11, that's called the chapter of gratitude. Now listen to this approach that he has.
Devorah?
Yes, go ahead.
I'm sorry to interrupt, but it makes me think about a time when, you know, I'm struggling because I gave somebody something once like this, you know, the rabbi refused the refrigerator. That's not nice to the person who gave it to them. It's like,
correct. We're going to get there in the next chapter where he talks about if there was no place to receive, then why did God create this relation? Like there has to be a place to receive. We're going to talk about it.
Thank you.
Right? Because think about it. If we were never to be, again, it's going to be, he's going to really, what I explained in the first chapter and the real nuance of being a taker versus a receiver is once again going to be revisited over here. But yes, of course, remember that if you're taking, I'll address this here and then we'll move on. But if you're taking for the purpose of giving, that means that you are a giver. There's always room to be able to take. If somebody worked very hard to get you something and you slap it back in their face and say, sorry, like I don't take things, it's not being a giver. That's not why Hashem put that opportunity in the world. But we're going to get there next chapter. So this chapter is chapter 11. Any other, I guess I'm going to pause more on Zoom because it might sometimes be hard to step in. So any other comments before I move on to chapter 11? Okay, so here we move into this topic of gratitude, okay? And what he says over here, this is really interesting. He says, what is the nature of gratitude and thanksgiving? What is their origin in the human psyche? And when, well, his word is whence. I don't know whoever translated that, whence. I don't like that word, whence. Whence comes that ingratitude, which is the affliction of so many of the human race? Where does this all stem from? Gratitude, ingratitude, what is this all about? He says, even with gratitude. Now you might think gratitude, we're grateful to either God or to another human. we must be at the level of being a giver. We're giving gratitude, right? But what he explains over here is that even with gratitude, there's a difference between being a giver and being a taker. Here too, you can see the difference. And what he says is the giver, the real ultimate giver, feels profoundly that he has to reject these free gifts. If somebody comes to him and gives him something, he might feel like he has to reject it because he's not a taker, he's a giver. The desire of his being is to give, not to draw to himself things that are outside of him. Consequently, when he does receive anything from anyone else, he is immediately prompted to give something equivalent in return. And if he is unable to do this in kind, his heart urges him to repay. How? By giving happiness to that person by way of thanks and appreciation. It's so interesting because I was just working with a couple and it was their anniversary, and the wife worked so hard to think of a very perfect gift for her husband. And she presented it to him, and without him even opening it up, appreciating it, like anything, the response was, oh my gosh, like I forgot to get you a gift. And he whipped out his phone at that moment and he said, I have to order you something right now. So you can imagine what this must have felt like. But one of the things that actually came up is that perhaps another way to look at this scenario is that maybe he's such a giver that it was hard for him to be on such the receiving end. It was a total flip of the scenario, meaning this woman was so angry. She came in with such resentment. But when you look at it through that lens, which happens to be, as she agreed, it probably was coming from that place. Suddenly, it's coming from a place of, hold on one second, he's struggling with only being a taker right now. So what Rabbi Dessler is saying over here is that if a person is not able to either, like they have to be the receiver, like the person's giving them something, but they can't give anything back right that second. So what does the real giver do? Immediately turns it into thanks and appreciation. Okay, that's a giver, has such gratitude. Hakarat hatov. As we all know, the premise of what it means to be a Jew, gratitude. However, here's where it gets really interesting. However, the taker, on the other hand, wants only to draw himself as much as he can, whether by robbery, deceit, or other ways of getting something for nothing. In his heart of hearts, in the depth of his heart, he believes that everything is his. Everything and everyone are there for his sake. You hear the difference in the mentality? When he receives some favor from his friend, he consequently feels absolutely no obligation to repay this favor. He takes it for granted that people should just do things for him. That's just the way he thinks of it. He is thus by nature ungrateful. You may find a taker. This is the part that I think is most interesting. You may find a taker expressing thanks, sometimes even really beautifully, but don't you trust him or his thanks. Gratitude may be on his lips, but it is not in his heart. He is quite prepared to cover himself in the cloak of gratitude, knowing that this may assist him to obtain further favors and gifts in the future. It becomes clear, therefore, that his gratitude is also taking, since this is its object. To sum up, true gratitude derives from the power of giving, while ingratitude is spawned by the power of taking. So I think this example is just very, very insightful, that even one, you might have, again, it goes back to the idea that you could have two people doing the identical things. They're doing the same thing. The gratitude won't be even expressed in the same way. And yet one is coming from a complete place of taking, while the other is coming from being such a giver and knowing, like, I'm not going to give anything back, so all I can do is give a compliment. While the taker is only giving the compliment to think, what else can I gain from this situation? So it's a fascinating thing, first of all, just to think about ourselves always, like what that's stemming from and where that's coming from. And also just to think about other people that we've encountered in our lives And also, as we always use the word nuance, to notice the nuance. Is there something more about the gratitude of a real, and I'm posing this as a question to you, is there something more about the gratitude of a real giver than the gratitude of a taker? Rabbi Dessler does not discuss this. The chapter ends there. But I have been giving a lot of things to that, a lot of thought to that. I have been thinking about that. How does it show up differently? Does it feel differently? Is it worded differently? What is the nuance about the thanks from a person who is coming from being a giver versus giving a taker? I'm curious to hear if you have any thoughts. Rachel?
Okay, I figured out how to unmute myself.
Yay.
Step one. To me, I think you sort of feel it in your gut, for lack of a better term. Like if it feels warm and fuzzy, and maybe this is my experience. If it feels warm and fuzzy and you feel a feeling of sort of trust and mutual understanding, I think that is sort of sincere gratitude. If that, a voice sort of starts to say, what is the ulterior motive, or this doesn't feel quite right, or it feels yucky, perhaps it is yucky. I don't know. It's kind of like that
Okay.
inner
So
voice.
I think that's also what Beth just put into the chat. Very, very
sorry,
well
I
said.
didn't
Like
see
that
the chat.
heartfelt, that sincerity. You can kind of feel it. It's a gut feeling.
I was just building. Oh, I'm sorry.
Go ahead, Beth. Go ahead.
I just wanted to clarify to Rachel. I was just building off of what Rachel was saying without trying to interrupt.
Yeah.
I layering on top of it. I think that there's a sincerity and there's a genuine aspect to it.
Mm-hmm.
And yeah, that's what I would say.
Mm-hmm. Yes, better put than me.
No.
Listen, when we're on Zoom, everybody has to just chime in because it's not the same, like you throw in a comment here or there, so you got to speak up. Amy, I see your hand.
Yeah, I was going to say from the perspective of the taker instead of the giver. For me, when somebody gives to me either in the way of time or, things or what have you, or just being there for me, I immediately go to, well, how am I going to repay them? Or what am I going to be able to do for them? So I think that on the giving and taking, there's got to be that sincerity.
Yeah, that definitely comes from a place of sincerity and kind of labels you as an ultimate giver. If that is your immediate thought, which is exactly what Rabbi Dessler points out, like that's their automatic. Okay, like I just received that. How do I?
The other thing that comes to mind that I lost my word, but I found it again, is that when it's a taker, I feel like, and Amy reminded me, I feel like there's a sense of entitlement. That when you give to somebody who is a giver, there's that like heartfelt, sincere, I think Rachel said like warm fuzzies. And then when you give to somebody who to me is a little bit more of a taker, it's like a sense of entitlement, like, oh, right. Yeah, thank you. Thanks for doing, like, it just is like a little something that is just a different energy. Mm-hmm. That feels like it comes with like an entitlement rather than a gratitude.
Devorah, with with the giver, there's an honesty, there's an expanse, there's this like soothe of, oh, of course they did, or whatever. There's with the taker, sometimes the receiver, there's like a hesitant because maybe they're not, I'm thinking of a particular situation that there's not the instinct for them to react that way. It's like they just can't seem to do it. And they'll say, oh yeah, thank you. Oh, I meant to say thank you. And with the giver, it's just there. It's like velvet or hot fudge. It just soothes you, just like nod and feel good about it,
Yeah.
I love that. Velvet and hot fudge. That's
velvet and hot fudge. Yeah, those are good words to the journalist herself.
Yeah.
I don't know.
It's like the whole package. And then with the receiver, it's like, okay, they checked off the box and they are done. And I'll accept that because in some cases, that's all they can give. That's their capacity. And for
Totally.
some of us, like all of us on this call, we we are givers. Our arms reach out differently or more expansively. We just think that way. It's our instinct, you know?
Mhm,
Totally.
mhm.
So I know this, I'm not sure this is a great example, but I thought about it. Most of us at one time wrote thank you notes, right?
Mhm.
And clearly a dying art, sadly, but when someone writes a note or even a text for something that you've given them, I don't necessarily think it means they're a taker if they do this, but maybe they're not as much of a giver. Like you can tell by the tone of a thank you, like did they just write it to quote check
Check
the
off the
box?
box, right?
Or they genuinely, sincerely appreciative for whatever it is you gave or did for them.
Mhm.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, so I think actually what I love what you said about tone, because even like for me, I was thinking about like anytime that I receive, I always feel so overwhelmed with gratitude, but sometimes, you know, you like for me, this chapter really made me pause. Like, am I properly expressing this through my tone? Or is this starting to sound rote? Is this the kind of thing that like the person on the other end can genuinely feel? So for me, the practical takeaway wasn't like, let me majorly change my approach over here. It was more just like, just pause. Like if you're about to send a text or if you're about to write the note, like, is it felt through? Like, can that person still feel it? And for sometimes it's like you're writing, you know, for real givers, and some of you know who you are, like constantly giving things, and like I want to acknowledge, but like I want to make sure that each thank you text sounds genuine, you know. So I appreciate that word in tone. I think that is true. It also made me really think about the way that we're raising our children, and I think that you know, for the people on this call, we're very much in the same boat. But if we can look to the outside world at large, it is an art that is falling by the wayside. Gratitude is not something that, the same way we can feel it in our bones, right? But
Mhm.
Rabbi Dessler is saying over here, look what's happening. I mean, we are living in such an I-focused generation that this art of gratitude, which is like the automatic response that somebody has when they're a real giver should have, it's not happening. And so in thinking about the next generation and how we really encourage that, and how sometimes it's what we discussed last week, that idea of mitoch shelo lishma, balishma, you sometimes just got to do it and hope that ultimately that feeling will start to kick in on the inside. But in just in general, you know, the society at large, if you think about what he's saying over here, it's an art that is becoming less and less seen. So for all of us on the call, I think we all feel like we fall into a certain category, and it feels really nice. When we think about what's going on in the bigger picture in the world at large, it's a little bit scary.
Devorah,
Yes.
I recently did something for someone, and some of it is instinct and timing and the ooze. I sent something or mentioned that something, and there was an immediate response with a text of OMG, and what a special thing. You know, it's the reaction, and it made me feel good, and it made me want to do more. And I've made the point with my kids as instruction of, don't forget your thank yous. You know, like you got Amazon showed up at your door, and I recently sent my kids something and I didn't hear back. And I realized that's weird. And in fact, we're trying to track the package. They couldn't thank for what they didn't get. And so, you know, but I know, you know, once we dig, and there are people who, oh, I'll thank them when I see them, or I don't. Oh, I'm sure it's important. You know, it's a circle. If you want to get back and you want to be able to give and then be the taker, and if you've received, you've got to follow the path and say, you know, thank you, this was great, or you know, whatever, and keep it going. It's
Nancy,
important.
what Nancy was just saying is what I was literally like just putting together in my head, that there's this aspect where you give someone a gift, and someone who comes to mind is, one of Devorah's daughters, who is just so appreciative. When you get a genuine thank you from someone, like what Nancy's saying, the person that said, OMG, this is so nice. Thank you so much. And Nancy said it made her want to do more.
Right.
We can express gratitude and thanks in a way that gives the giver something. Like it's not just
Absolutely.
like a thank you note. Like
Right.
when you get when you genuinely give someone that you care about a gift, and they express like heartfelt, sincere gratitude, you as the giver are given a gift back.
Mm-hmm.
So that like
Absolutely.
is really, I think, like full circle.
Hot fudge. It's hot fudge.
It's
Yeah.
gooey. It's really gooey, Nancy.
Yeah, it is.
Yeah.
Lava
Yeah, or
cake
taking
gooey.
a moment and recognizing when you're using the thing that you were a recipient of, and just either sending a text or taking a moment even in yourself and just being like, wow, like this is so, like, I'm so grateful to this person for this. Like I wouldn't have this in my life. But just as an aside, going back to society at large, I heard this example by somebody like years ago when the Alexa first came out, and I thought it was funny. Like I laughed at it, except now I really see it. But just the way that we speak to an Alexa, the way that it sounds so dumb. It sounds so dumb, but if you think about what we're doing to our muscles, we are commanding, receiving, and there is zippo thanks. There is zippo. There's no thanks. There's no please. There's no thank you. Now you might think, Devorah, like, come on, it's an Alexa, like it's a robot, By the way, I'm a little weird. When I use, on the occasion that I use ChatGPT, I say thank you for the response. Mm-hmm. Now that is bizarre.
Of course you do.
There is not a human on the other end, right. But it's for myself. They just gave me, this robot just supplied me with an insight that I didn't have. How about a quick thank you, right? Like it's part of a muscle building. And even though it seemed so weird to me when I heard it at the time, I see the value. I see the value because it's part of how we're training ourselves to work.
Siri says you're welcome, by the way.
Does she?
Yeah. My Australian
But
Siri.
not heartful.
I love that. I don't use Siri, so I don't know. Yeah, I love that.
Devorah,
sorry. Nancy, go ahead.
Devorah, it's funny, when I was with my granddaughters for 3 weeks, and they talk to Alexa more than they talk to each other, and they were constantly, turn on the timer or set the timer or this, and every time they did it, I kept saying, "Thank you, Alexa," and after a couple of days, they were like nodding or "Oh, thank you, Alexa." I said,
Yeah.
She's doing something for you.
She's doing something, exactly.
Well, it's funny, Nancy, that you just, funny, Nancy, that you just said that, because also having grandchildren around, it's something that we do all the time with them.
Absolutely.
The little 3-year-olds, and we're constantly please and thank you with Alexa, with Google, all of that.
Mm-hmm.
So, yeah, it's really important. And it is a lost art. The
lost art.
Thank you notes, I saved some of them that are so special.
Mm-hmm.
There was a thing about Lady Di that she always wrote a thank you note.
Oh, really?
Yeah.
I love that.
Nice thing.
So
I
have a
my issue is the taking, sometimes not being so kind about it.
Mm-hmm.
That's like something, like someone once brought me a frosted cake for my birthday, and I don't eat it. I don't want it. She worked hard. I was almost annoyed. Like, why'd you spend your time on this? Like, just take it, give it to your kids. And it wasn't a nice exchange. And I still think back to that. It was a long time ago, but it is, sometimes it's hard to take when it's not needed, or you don't want it, or it seems wasteful. There's so much waste in this world. So.
Wow. I think what you're saying has a lot of profundity to it. I think in the beginning of, being a real giver, we discussed the idea of like always thinking about the recipient. So first of all, there's two things about that. Number one is like, was she really being a giver? You know, for the person who gave you the cake, what were they really thinking? What did my friend want to receive? And then there's the other piece of you realizing that regardless of whether she thought about it or not, she was trying to make a gesture, and I still have to show up graciously, you know? So it's the combination. But I think the lesson over there for you is, and I get this sometimes when like people give like a gift, I'm like, what in the world? Like that was so like, that was such a selfish gift, you know? But it's coming from a place of good, but it makes me think like, when I'm going to give a gift next time, am I really thinking what the person will want to receive? Or am I just thinking like, what's the easiest for me to get? So, you know, I don't know. I always think about that as somebody who has 2 diabetic sisters. I was always very sensitive to cakes. You know, when people would show up with sugary things at my house, it's like, hello, like, do you not know? Well, now I have 2 diabetic sisters. I grew up with 1 diabetic sister. And like anytime anybody would walk in with candy, I was like, hello, like I have a sister here who can't touch that. Like, don't give me that stuff. Don't give it, bring it in our house. And that's not good giving, you know? And it's just because that's easiest for them to pick up, like grab a candy platter and why not? So I was always very, very sensitive to that. But really when we are a giver, we need to really think, we need to put ourselves into the shoes of the recipient and think like, is this something that we think that they'll enjoy? So that's the takeaway as well. Okay, I'm going to move on because I think the next chapter brings up, we're still in the ambition chapter, but here it's called The Perfected World. And it's chapter 12. And now he's going to bring up the question, Gail, that I mentioned before. And he says like this, he says, people have actually asked me, I repeat that this chapter is so much better in Hebrew, but okay. I've seen it in Hebrew and in English. He says, people have asked me the following question. If God did not want man to be a taker, but to be entirely self-sufficient, then why did he create man in a plural environment and make him a social being? Surely it would have been preferable to create each individual in a world of his own, where there would be no possibility of jealousy or competition. You have to ask the question, right? Like in the beginning of the chapter, when we started this whole idea, we explained it, and then we also discussed it a little bit in the femininity series. But the idea of like there has to be both. It can't be that God would just create one. So you have to ask the question though, like if we're speaking so much about the giver over here and how we're supposed to be striving towards being the giver, where is the space for a taker? Like God, like maybe we were supposed to be created in isolated bubbles, you know? So he says his answer was twofold. He points out 2 things. He says, first of all, if man was not a social being, he would not be able to choose between taking and giving. Taking would simply be precluded by the nature of things. Hashem created man to be a free being who could distinguish between good and evil and then choose the good. This is why the 2 forces were implanted inside of man, and he was given the task of choosing the power of giving and to avoid the faculty of taking, thus ensuring his success both here and for eternity. The Torah makes this quite clear, and this is something that we've discussed when we learned this parsha inside. This is from the 5th book of the Torah in Parshat Devarim, and it says there, I have put before you life and death, so that you shall live, so that you may live and that your children may live. Choose life, right? I have put hayom re'eh, hayom nasati lifnechem hachayim v'hamavet uvacharta b'chayim. I have placed before you life and death. And you, as a human, I'm telling you, you choose life. So the first thing that he brings up over here is that it can't be. It can't be that we're just like isolated things, that we're all just supposed to be operating on a place of like just being givers, because where would be the choice? So over here, he's bringing in this whole entire concept of, I think it's actually very empowering, but it's the idea of every time we become a giver or a taker, we're making that choice. There's a choice that we are leaning into. Now, we said in the very beginning, God put poor people and needy people into this world so that the people who can give can fill that void, and that there could be that symbiotic relationship. It has to be that way. But even on an individual basis, even for the person who's there, let's say very poor, very impoverished, there are still ways that that taker can be a receiver and a giver, right? Like can turn that into something so beautiful. So that's the idea of free will. That's the idea, and I have to pull up this thing that I just saw this morning. That's the idea that every moment we are making these decisions. We are deciding whether or not we're going to turn that action, that thought, that gratitude, that whatever it's coming from, into a place of being a giver, or are we blowing the opportunity and only being a taker? So it doesn't exactly have to do with this, but I'm going to share it here anyways, because it kind of ties in. So one of my friends is in Israel right now. She's on a mission right now. And she posted this morning that one of the soldiers, she's going to write out the whole story and share it with me because I was so moved, but I screenshotted this picture, and it was a new tattoo of a soldier who just put this on his arm. And he did this at post October 7th. And it says, the fact that you breathe doesn't mean that you are alive. So I was very, very moved, and I'm intrigued to hear, obviously, his story and why he chose to put this on his arm. It's like his entire forearm. But I think that that's exactly the concept over here that we're discussing, right? This idea of uvacharta b'chaim. Just because we're breathing doesn't mean that we have chosen life. We say this all the time and we reiterate this point, but here I'm specifically saying it with this idea of being a giver or a taker. We constantly have that choice. And uvacharta b'chaim is in one person's arena and one person's arena only, and that is ourselves. Yes, Lynn.
I think that in all of this, man is a work in progress. We're never going to be perfect. And we never stop learning. And we never stop evolving without taking both roles.
Correct.
Evolving and evolving. So it only makes sense that there's balance. You know, that and my thoughts listening to all this and the high level stuff is that 99% of us are not all just takers. That most people have a conscience, I'd like to think. They go in and out of it. People aren't always takers. Sometimes they, maybe 10 years later, they have a light bulb goes off. But because people are a work in progress, they evolve. If they let themselves be a work in progress, if they let themselves evolve, they can evolve. And that's part of living. And that's the difference between just breathing and living, is recognizing this, I think.
Mm-hmm. Lynn, there is so much beauty to what you just said. And I would like to believe that it is true. I don't know if it's true. You probably surround yourself by really good people, and you look at the world in that way. I have to almost chuckle because that I'm listening to this series. I have to ask my father to send me more, but he sent me a few of the classes that he taught on this topic, I don't know, at least 30 years ago. And it was this exact dialogue where a guy is like, but Rabbi, I really believe, and it was exactly your point. Like, majority of people are probably givers. Like, at some point, maybe they come and, go and flow, and it's, but they're all striving. And my father heavily pushes back. So I don't know. I don't know the answer. I think that it's hard to say the world at large. I don't know.
I'm not ignorant to the fact of our reality, of the reality in this world. But the only way that I can keep going is to try to believe this. You can't be, I know.
Meaning if we think that 99% of the world are all takers, forget it. Right.
Right. I mean, you have to look obviously at the good in the world. You have to hold on to the good in the world. It's not, and again, in the end, I mean, I know you like to believe that in the end, there's the Messiah will come and we'll be walking the earth, and it'll be all good and we'll be with people that we've lost in the past. So I think you have to go through bad to get to the good, unfortunately. But I'd like to believe, may not be 99%, that most people are good and most people are not pure takers. And most people can see,
Ebb and flow.
do have an ebb and flow, and they do have an empathetic spark in them.
Amen. Amen. Listen, everybody has a soul. So there has to be
Right.
that empathetic spark.
Right.
Has to be. And I think that the awareness of this is it's just key. It's very, very important. It's important to recognize, and it's important to continue striving. But yeah, amen. Amen. I would like to leave it as an amen. And I do agree. And I think the more that we see in others the giving abilities that they have, and how, like, even when you feel like you're dealing with such a taker, but when you can focus on how you see giving even within them, you know, that hopefully that giving spark will continue to grow. In our mind, I just feel like I have to say this, because even though Rabbi Dessler discusses this idea of like, you can't either be like, you're either a giver or a taker, it's a very high level of thinking. In our simple, I'm going to include in our simple mind, we do give and take. There is give and take, and it's not so black and white. He has a very, very specific high level understanding of either you're a giver or a taker, but we see, like, it's not so simple to understand that idea. Like, sometimes you see that somebody could be a real giver, and sometimes you see that they have to go into a place of being a taker. But I think that the rubrics over there really goes into, is it a taker or is it a receiver? This hostage, Sapir Cohen, who was part of the first release, whose boyfriend was actually just released this past Shabbat. So she's been on a few podcasts in her broken English. She's really something else. But I just remember her saying, like, she was very driven by the idea of, like, purpose. You know, what was going to be her purpose? Like, if this happened, there had to be purpose to it. And I think I shared this even with this Tuesday class, but like, she made it her mission to see, like, well, I have nothing to give. There's nothing I can give. But she found a girl who was younger than her, and her mission every day became, how can I give a smile? How can I make this other girl smile? That's like a giver at her core, you know, like, there's something there that was just, she was such a giver that, like, even at that moment where she was like, I had nothing to give, she was still able to look at herself with purpose. It's a high level. Like, it's not everybody's like that. So, but anyways, Lynn, I do very much appreciate your point, and, you know, please God, hopefully that is the case. I don't know. You know, I'm not God. I don't know. But I would also like to believe that majority of people are coming from a good place.
Mm-hmm.
You know, and then you also hear, like, the Talmud tells us, like, we have, like, from the time that we're young, we're born with this evil inclination, and it takes a lifetime of work to rid that, you know? So it's hard to know. It's very hard to really know. But he has a second nuance over here that he says. He says there's a second reason that there has to be both the giver and the taker in this world. And he says that if men were not social beings and did not need each other, there would, of course, be no possibility of giving either. So that one is, like, almost like, duh, you know, like, obvious. The concept of giving would not exist if there was nobody to give it to. So if once you already create a world where you need to be a giver, and that's what we're striving towards, then you obviously have to have the takers, the receivers. It has to be that way. Okay. So, you okay?
Oh, he looks so sad. Oh, poor Boo Boo.
Okay. So he says that in this discussion, he says one of our group then came back with the following question. And he says, since it is true that there can be no giving without someone receiving what is given, then is it true that surely all giving itself is ultimately going to lead to evil? Meaning the giver is creating a taker, and Rabbi Dessler is saying that taking seems to be evil. So here is where, I'm just going to say this quickly, but here is where, again, Gail, we differentiate between the taker and the receiver. So he says it over here in English. He says, it follows too that there can never be a perfected world. If all human beings were to become givers, then who would there be to take from them? So he says, these are very interesting questions. If we devote a little more thought, then it seems like it's really self-explanatory. There's a great difference between a recipient and a taker. And similarly, between a giver and, quote, one from whom things are taken. You hear that? That's actually the nuance there more.
Yeah.
One from whom things are taken, that's not a giver. If somebody is only giving because it's taken from them, right? It needs to happen. That's not coming from a place of giving. So there's a difference between those two types of givers and takers. We would do well not to confuse these concepts. There's a type of person who takes and lets people take from him. This is the one possessed by the power of taking. His taking arises from self-love. He wants only to take and would much prefer not to give at all. If anything is taken from him, this is only because he is unable to prevent it. There's another person. There's the one who gives and receives. He is the giver whose giving flows from the source of pure goodness in his heart, and whose receiving immediately fills his heart with gratitude and payment for whatever he receives. The explanation is this. Both types, the giver and the taker, in fact, pay for what they get in the majority of cases. The difference is that the giver does not want to take anything without payment, and the very least, he pays by sincere thanks and appreciation. So he goes on just to explain this a little bit more. I'm going to skip a little bit. But the end paragraph over here is that in the perfected world is going to be a world where every person, without exception, gives to and benefits others, and whose heart overflows with gratitude for what he receives from others. A human society such as this is the perfect and happy society, overflowing with peace and love, and that is the society that Hashem delights. So in the perfect world, there would be givers and receivers, but even the receivers would be coming from that place of tremendous gratitude. They would be able to give with the little bit that they'd be able to give, whether it's the words of gratitude or somehow sharing what they already have. And that is what Rabbi Dessler is describing. That really would be the ideal state. Now, if you think about that in terms of ambition, it's a very different world. It's a very different picture than what this class has constantly been discussing about the rat wheel of life. Always trying to strive higher, always trying to get to the next status, always trying to accomplish more, always, always, always. Over here, it just seems, I don't know, to me, even when I read that paragraph of what he's describing as this more perfect world, it's so much more relaxed. It's so much less pressurizing. It's so much more in the place of like this, potach at yadecha, like I'm just going to receive whatever I'm meant to receive. I'll share what I can share. Like it's so much more like calm and not like chase. So that's what he describes.
Devorah?
Yes.
It almost, I mean, if I'm going to simplify everything, I mean, the whole class to me could almost be summarized as giving and taking from gratitude.
Giving and taking from gratitude.
You're grateful you can
Almost.
give, and you're grateful you can receive.
More.
Yeah, I don't know.
Yeah, I mean, it's missing a lot of nuance if you say it that way, but that would be definitely a summary from today. I think that would be a fair summary. Like, where is that really coming from? I was just thinking of another example and it just left me. I had a specific example in mind, but I keep thinking about the soldiers. I keep thinking about the hostages. I keep thinking about the way that they operated and how, I don't know, there's just so much there about just the idea of being givers at their core. I don't know. It's just, it's powerful to think about.
So is
As
he,
opposed to our enemy turf, which is like the exact opposite. Yeah.
is he saying there should be no ambition?
No, he's not. And he says that in the beginning chapter of ambition. He says it just has to be, you have to be careful with what the ambition is for. And he actually does say that spiritual ambition, there is a must for. And for the other things, you have to be careful of the level of ambition. There should be a desire to strive and to accomplish. But he says, be very, very careful, especially in the physical realm of what that ambition looks like.
Mm-hmm.
For the right reasons.
For the right reason. If you're trying to, we always get into this very interesting philosophical question, like for the person who can, the person who becomes very, very wealthy, but is using his wealth to supply money to the organizations that are providing. So there's so much value in that and the ambition to try to become wealthy. And then there's also like the organizations that are trying to provide value. So like, which path you choose when you're like trying to guide a kid who's like trying to figure it out, like, do you go and run the organization or do you become the wealthy person that can supply? So a lot of it has to do with, you know, where that ideology is, where are you placing that? So if you're coming from a place where your ambition is for you to be a giver, that ties into spirituality, in which Rabbi Dessler has already established there should be no end to a spiritual ambition. If your goal is to be a giver at your core, now we only can determine if it really is coming from that place of giver, with no name attached, with no accolades, with right. But if that very high level, remember, very high, lofty stuff, Lynn. But if we can get to that place, then that's ideal. So that's really the measuring stick over there. You know, where is that ambition? What is the ambition really for? And is it coming from that proper place? So I'll just end off with this really interesting story that the Medrash brings down. And again, it just kind of shows us a difference in approach. It's a story of Alexander the Great. And he was from Macedonia. He was a world conqueror, for those of you who are familiar, just a huge person, a huge ego. And he's traveling and he comes across this kingdom. I don't know where this is. Actually never heard about it till this book. Place called Cassia, okay? He comes to this kingdom of Cassia. He becomes very friendly with this king. And the king says to him, I'm going to show you how our judicial courts work. I want to show you. So Alexander the Great is watching the following scenario, and two men come before, and one man had just bought a piece of land. And when he bought the land, he started digging the land, and he came across a huge treasure. And the person who sold him the land is standing in the court right next to him. And they're fighting over, plot twist, they're fighting over, it's not rightfully mine. They're both saying it's not rightfully mine, meaning the guy who found the treasure is saying, I didn't buy the piece of land knowing there was a treasure. I want to return the treasure to you. And the guy who sold him the land is saying, but I sold you the land not knowing there was the treasure. So the treasure really should rightfully belong to you. Mm-hmm. And they're having this debate in this court. So the king of Cassia, the judges of this Cassia place, this is unbelievable, says, you know what? This is a tough call. I really don't know what to be said over here. So here's what we're going to do. You both have children? They say, yeah, we both have children. You have a man? You have a woman? This is what we're going to do. They're going to marry. And the treasure is going to go to their children. This way, it will be both of you combined, and they'll both get a little piece of the treasure. Wow, seems so simple. I love it. But here's where the end of the story comes, and this is why, and this is a story brought down in the Medrash Rabbah. Alexander the Great, huge ego, conqueror of the world, is so perturbed. He's so disgusted. And he says, he's astonished. And the king says to him, like, why? Like, why are you so surprised? Like, this is such a great outcome. And he says to him, and I quote, he says, would you not have done the same thing in your country? And Alexander replies, we would have put both parties to death, and the royal treasury would have confiscated the property. So the king of, here I'm going to read to you, the king of Cassia answered, does the sun shine in your country? Yes, replied Alexander. Do you have animals? Asked the king. Yes, replied Alexander. Now I understand, said the king of Cassia. If you have rain and sunshine, it's not in your merit. It's in the merit of the animals. As it says, save, O God, man and beast. Man, the merit of the beast. Mm-hmm. He's bringing here such an extreme example by Alexander the Great, who couldn't even understand how there could be such a place of coming from a place of giving. You understand? He was coming from such a place of being a taker that he would put both parties to death and keep the treasure for the royalty. So this is a very extreme example, and it shows us really, he says, Rabbi Dessler says, this wonderful midrash explained to us in the most clear terms the vast difference between what givers and takers are. And he says this is the characteristic of givers. Givers unite in giving as well as in receiving, so that they can be a part of the perfection in the world. Mm-hmm. But the place of taking is exactly the opposite. The place of taking goes so far that the king would have condemned to death the virtuous givers as destroyers of the established order of society, and they would have just been confiscated from them and given over to the government. To that point, as the Medrash said, beasts are better than you. So I'm going to read this last paragraph and the general takeaway from this paragraph, which is now Gail adding to this whole idea of gratitude. And he says, takers harm each other, for the taker makes the person from whom he takes a taker in his turn. His aim now is to try his best to get back what was taken from him. But givers, they complete each other. The giver arouses a spirit of giving in the recipient, whose aim is now to give back in gratitude that which he has received. So I think it's very, very interesting over here. And we're finishing up. We have one last chapter in this entire part of ambition. It's going to be about the love of God. That's what it's titled. So we'll pick up from that next week and we'll finish off this whole section of ambition. And then we'll move on to our next topic and strive for truth. Does anybody have any questions or comments? Okay. Thank you all so much. May we all merit to truly strive to become givers. Have a wonderful, wonderful day, and thank you for your flexibility.